we're going to introduce tonight's speaker and where he's from. Our speaker is Mike Pierce. He is here from the National Museum of Industrial History. National Museum of Industrial History, for those of you who don't know, is in Bethlehem. I'm scrolling through my notes here to make sure I don't screw up any biographical details or speech details, and I scrolled too far. Great. I went to those instead. Of course I did. Give me 1 second here to regain my footing. There we go. There we go. And back to Zoom. Where are you all? There you are. The National Museum of Industrial History is located inside the former Bethlehem Steel, which many of us are very familiar with in Bethlehem. It recognizes, and scroll back down. I am not doing well at this. It's located inside the former Bethlehem Steel Mill and celebrates the industrial history of our nation. Mike, our speaker for tonight, is a member of the staff there. He's been with the NMIH for over 17 years. He graduated with a bachelor's in history from Moravian and has a master's in history from Lehigh. He's been instrumental in their research and interpretation behind the museum's collection, and as well as the actual physical relocation and restoration of the industrial equipment in the facility and at others. Tonight, he's going to give us a wonderful talk about the metals industry history within our chapter bounds, a perfect subject for this 100th anniversary. Without further ado, I am going to shut up and turn it over to Mike. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to do this talk for you. What I'm going to do now, images for my presentation here. So it should be up momentarily. And before we talk about the metals industry in Northeast Pennsylvania, the subject is so large that you could really write several books on it. So what we see here today is only a sampling of what the industry was and is. So if I miss anybody, your company, please accept my apologies. But we're going to go starting back in time, back in 1716. Naturally, there was no photography back then, so what I'm showing you here is an image of a recreation we did at our museum a couple of years ago. And this is a lump of bloomery iron. The first ironworks in the region started in 1716 in Berks County. And the industry really blossomed around southeastern Pennsylvania, moving into central Pennsylvania. And this was a time where you used local iron supplies from local mines. They could be open pits, quarries, rudimentary tunnels, and these little hand-built furnaces called bloomeries. They're maybe 3, 4, 5 feet high. You had air that blew in from the wind, maybe by a hand-powered blast. And the reaction happened inside them to such a point that what you ended up with was a lump of iron that was very low in carbon, had a lot of slag mixed into it. So what you see here is somebody actually pulling that lump, which is a little bit bigger than a basketball, out of the furnace, which was off of the picture to the right, and they're actually getting ready to hammer it and start purifying that iron. So the iron industry in the state really looked like that for about 100 years or so. And it really was focused down just on the boundaries of your chapter region. It wasn't until 1808 that finally somebody in Northampton County actually built a bloomery furnace, but they were really late to the game. That was William Henry and Nazareth. Those of you who've been up to Jacobsburg have probably seen the museum up there and the Henry rifles. That's the same family. So it wasn't too long after that that he realized that technology was progressing to the point where he could actually have an iron furnace. So the first iron furnace in the Lehigh, well, Northampton County at least, was built by him in 1824, 1825. And It was a very small furnace by modern standards, but it worked. It was about 32 feet high, and produced about 12 to 14 tons of castings in a week. So that's really what the iron industry looked like for a few decades in the Lehigh Valley and the surrounding area. You have these stone furnaces making the 30, 40 feet high range, used charcoal. So anybody who's ever used charcoal knows that it burns up fairly quickly, and it has to come from a renewable resource, mainly trees. So to make 1 ton of iron at a charcoal furnace, you might be looking at an acre or more of trees that you have to cut down. So they had a very finite field that they could draw from. It's not like furnaces in later years where you had coal and you could ship the coal in by rail. You had to go out with horse and wagon and harvest the wood, convert the wood to charcoal, then feed it into these furnaces. And there were well over 400 charcoal pits on the Blue Mountain area alone. So these things got depleted fairly quickly. And just like in England, they realized that you had to look for a new source of fuel. Now, what happened in the United States, especially in this area, was we had anthracite coal. Think about Carbon County, how it got its name from carbon. Well, that's the main ingredient in anthracite. So when the War of 1812 hit, the United States was trying to figure out where do you get your coal from. Before that war, you would usually bring it up by ship from Virginia or even import it all the way from England or Wales. So when the war hit and the blockade started, they were trying to develop their domestic coal resources much closer to New York and Philadelphia where they actually needed it. So they asked themselves, well, this coal mileage-wise isn't that far away. It's a lot closer than Virginia or Wales, but you had all these mountains to overcome, rivers that you could really only make one-way trips on. So after they started mining coal in the Summit Hill area, they got the coal down to the Lehigh River. They would actually build arcs made out of wood and make one-way trips to Philadelphia, disassemble the boats, sell the wood for buildings, go all the way back to what's now Carbon County and start the whole process over again. So that really was not sustainable. But they began the process of putting a canal along the river. The canal allowed the coal to flow much more easily. And the canal promoters were also trying to figure out how do you make some extra money off of this canal. So what they quickly realized was that if they could find a way to make anthracite coal fuel for these furnaces that were using iron that was already existing in the fairly local region, then they could make a fortune transporting anthracite coal for the furnaces. And then what's even more important, not more important, but an added layer to the story, is they could sell land along the canal and also sell water from the canal to actually power these furnaces. So they went over to Europe and brought back David Thomas, who worked at an ironworks over there, and they started the Crane Ironworks in Catasauqua. They used the European technology, which used a hot blast to preheat the air going into the furnace. The preheated air was what allowed the anthracite to successfully burn inside the furnace and provide the carbon for the chemical reaction that produced metallic iron that actually came out of the furnace. So July 4th, 1840 is really the day that this technology exploded in the United States, right here in the Lehigh Valley, at Catasauqua along the Lehigh River and Lehigh Canal. So when you start looking at what happened immediately after that, you had a bunch of competitors emerge to use the same basic technology. So by the mid-1840s, actually by 1840 itself, the Scranton Iron Works was founded up in Scranton. And if you go back, let's say 140 years ago, and you look at some of the major iron producers, Scranton was right at the top, especially during the Civil War era. You can still go all the way out to the West Coast and look at old railroad rail and find Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company embossed on it. This operation was a huge, huge place. They eventually made the leap into steel. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But they had blast furnaces that you can still go and visit today. The ruins of them, the stonework is still there. But what happened with this plant was it was so successful, and the owners were so farsighted that they realized by the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries that if they wanted to survive, they had to move beyond anthracite coal, go with coke, and get closer to their ore supplies, which were coming in from the Great Lakes, Minnesota, all that transportation network. So they actually picked up the plant and moved it to the outskirts of Buffalo, New York. And that became Bethlehem Steel's Lackawanna plant in the early 20th centuries and lasted until the late 20th century. So I think most of you are probably familiar with the term pig iron. That's what these furnaces in the early days made. They call it pig iron because it looks like it looks like piglets suckling a sow when that molten glowing iron comes out of the furnace and is cast in the sand beds here. Now, one of the things I'm not going to be able to do in this presentation is go through every single furnace. There were 55 furnaces that we know of around the time of the Civil War in the Lehigh Valley. These things were like the warehouses today. They were popping up everywhere along the rivers, along the railroads, and it was really an icon of this area. So around the time of the Civil War, the majority of the iron produced in the United States came from the Lehigh Valley. There were also some significant technological advances that were made around the time periods 1840s to a little bit past the Civil War. So for example, you have the Montour Iron Works in Danville. They rolled the first iron T-rails in America. So if you look at a railroad track today and you look at the profile, it looks like an upside down T. That profile really came into being in the 1840s in this general part of the country. Year after that, they started making them in Scranton. And then pretty soon after that, with the spread of railroads going west, you had to not just have rails, but you had to have things like boilerplate. So you had Gibraltar Iron Works in Reading making boilerplate, competing with Lukens down in Coatesville. You had a pipe mill belt, tube mill belt, and Reading really became a center for ironworking at that time. By 1850, they had the steam-powered forge. And around the 1850s, you start seeing another wave of technological advancement. I thought this picture was going to be a little bit bigger. But as the anthracite industry developed and people started looking at Eastern Pennsylvania as a center for industry, they started looking at what other metals were available to work. And they quickly found that there was a large zinc deposit just south of Bethlehem. So what you see in this, unfortunately, small image is the pumping engine house on the upper left. And we believe it's some sort of breaker operation going down into the actual mine itself. So with the rise of zinc mining just south of Bethlehem, they would bring the zinc by wagon to Bethlehem itself. And in 1853, they opened up a zinc plant there. So if you're familiar with South Bethlehem today, if you go between steel stacks and the New Street Bridge, that's very roughly the area that this zinc plant was taking up. And there was really a pioneering zinc plant in this country, opened by Samuel Wetherill. He invented a process for actually harvesting the zinc that worked a lot better than the handful of companies that were doing it already. So this plant stayed in service for a number of years. It eventually located further to the east. And then in 1898, they actually moved up to Palmerton. And we'll discuss that as we move on in the talk. So we're still in the 1850s, and this anthracite iron boom is really taking off. So David Thomas, who was the guy who came over from Europe and taught us Americans how to smelt with anthracite, literally went across the river from Catasauqua to Hockadakwa near Allentown, set up a company where he started growing really exponentially. You can see two furnaces in this view here. And as time went on, he started acquiring other iron properties and had, I think, 8 or 9 furnaces within a few decades. Many other furnaces were built. This is Keystone Furnace near Reading. And you can see that this is a more recent photograph after they modernized it. So this is something I don't think any of us were old enough to have actually seen in person. But you can see they had hot blast stoves that don't look all that different from what you see at Bethlehem Steel surviving today. Furnace with an incline going up to the top of it. So some of these companies kept upgrading their furnaces and running them through the almost until the Great Depression in some cases. Another firm that existed back then was the Allentown Iron Works and the Allentown Rolling Mills. Again, if you look back in history, this was a fairly significant place. This was founded 1 year before Bethlehem Iron Company, which became Bethlehem Steel, got off the ground. So it's a really good side-by-side comparison to them. So this company specialized in making wrought iron products. They never made the leap to steel, but in terms of wrought iron, what they produced was actually a fairly broad array. They made structural beams, I-beams, channel, machinery, mine cars, nuts, bolts, rivets, axles, and then what surprised me is they even made bridges. So you can see the Allentown Rolling Mills, designers and contractors on this bridge plaque dated 1890. And this bridge, you can tell by the car in it, lasted for decades after it was constructed by them. All this while, the Lehigh Valley still was not alone in the advancements. Reading Iron Company built sheet mills. Bethlehem Iron Company took hold just down the road from Allentown. Scranton saw not just their furnaces expanding, but they also saw places like the Dixon Locomotive Company develop. So in Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, you actually had steam locomotives being manufactured. And there's not too many of these around today, but if you go to Six Flags Amusement Park in Texas, you can actually ride behind the Dixon steam locomotive. You can't ride behind one in Pennsylvania, though. So because Bethlehem Steel lasted so long, a lot of our collection deals with them. I try to keep a balance to it, but some of the more significant features I would like to show, like this 1862 image, which is our oldest image from Bethlehem, showing the flood that held up construction. You can see a blast furnace on cast house on the left, and then the mill building on the right, which held puddling furnaces. These are the types of furnaces that they were using to make wrought iron back then. On the right-hand side, you have a grate that air comes up from below, feeds coal above it. The heat from the coal bounces off of the ceiling of the furnace, heats up pig iron. And the pig iron, because it has a carbon content of about 4%, acts like, I explain this to layman's as having like salt in your ice. So as if you have a fairly low temperature, the carbon allows the cast iron to melt and become liquid. But as the carbon burns off, the solidification point, I got to think about this again, sorry. But it's like road salt. So when you have the higher temperature and the carbon's burned out, you're left with a solid component, which is basically that bloom that you saw in that earlier photograph. That's what you actually remove from the furnace because that's very, very, very low carbon. So during the process of working the furnace, you end up with this lump of semi-solid, kind of like Play-Doh-y iron that you take to squeezing machines where the slag is squeezed out, but just enough slag is left to act as these little filaments, like little glass strands is what it almost seems like. And that's what actually helps protect the wrought iron from corrosion. And that's why these furnaces remained in service for so long, because the product they made was very corrosion resistant because of that slag that was worked into them. So all of this started falling out of favor very, very quickly. By the 1870s, actually 1868, which is only 5 years after they began operation, Bethlehem quickly realized that if they wanted to survive, they had to move into steel. So they set aside their visions of being a regular old iron company and began investing in a steelmaking facility. That wasn't completed until 1873, but once they were able to make Bessemer steel, they were able to compete again on the national scene. And that's something that basically none of the other local companies did. They never made the leap from iron to steel. So Bethlehem is the one that ended up surviving the longest. A few more shots here just so you can get an idea of what these places look like. You had 4 converters in Bethlehem. You can see 3 of them in this shot. They're a lot like the AOD vessels you're familiar with today. They blew compressed air about 40 psi into the vessel. The carbon would burn out over a period of maybe 20 minutes, give or take, depending on what size vessel you're using and some other characteristics. So you can see they would tip the vessel over, they call it a converter, and pour it into ingots in the pit, ingot molds in the pit, strip the molds, and then you have your ingots that you can ship off, in the case of Bethlehem, right down the railroad tracks in the same building to your train of rolls and actually roll them out. So Bethlehem wasn't the only company in Northeast Pennsylvania to have Bessemer converters. Lackawanna invested in them in the 1870s. So this is a picture of their converters, which actually made this leap to New York State after 1902. So these things had a fairly long life in an industry that was rapidly evolving. Again, just another shot showing how they poured into the ladles and then teamed the ingots. It's just fascinating from a historian's point of view, and hopefully for your point of view too, and looking at how this process was done. I don't think there's any operation I'm familiar with that uses the same technique of crane pivoting on this with hot metal. It's all been taken over by electric overhead traveling cranes or trolley systems. But the process was really amazing and quite ingenious. Now, one of the interesting things that most people don't realize is that when you get outside the Lehigh Valley, people assume Bethlehem was the only place making steel. That was not the case. In the 1850s, Pottsville rolling mills started. They started as a typical puddling furnaces, making wrought iron. And then by 1877, they expanded to making structural shapes. And eventually, they started adding a couple of open hearth furnaces. So by the early 20th century, they were actually a legitimate but very small scale steelmaking shop. They finally shut down around 1930 or so, and Bethlehem Steel actually ended up purchasing them and scrapping the plant out to avoid the competition. Now, with the rise of the iron industry and other associated industries like slate, cement, you had a whole variety of companies that you could do a whole lecture on themselves, but this is just a sampling of some of the places, like Flory Manufacturing Company that got started in 1878, built over 7,000 hoisting engines for the local mines in Northeast Pennsylvania and really around the world until they stopped building them during the Great Depression. But if you were a town in Pennsylvania and you did not have a train depot and a foundry, you were really considered second class. So by now we're looking into the 1880s. And again, I'm just looking at my notes. There's so much I can't even get into just for the sake of time. But I should mention that there were so many other places, not just local foundries, but industries that had their own metalworking facilities, forge shops, blacksmith shops, foundries. The Lehigh Valley alone, Lehigh Valley Railroad was building their own steam locomotives at Beaver Meadow, Delano, Hazleton, Southeastern, Weatherly, Wilkes-Barre, and then after 1904 in Sayre, Pennsylvania. So just imagine the infrastructure required to build a locomotive, and this stuff was literally all over the place in this neck of the woods. So what I want to point out here is really what you have like in the 1880s, 1890s, if you were standing across the river from steel stacks in Bethlehem today, you look to the right where the Fahey Bridge would be, you'll see the zinc works over there. Look to the left. Sorry about the slides. And you would have seen the Bethlehem Iron Company. You can see that they were starting to take the more modern form with those hot blast stoves that look like what you see today. But they still have the stone cast houses, the old elevator and hand-charged furnaces. Guys would actually ride up those elevators with wheelbarrows full of coal or coke, limestone and iron ore, and dump them by hand into the furnaces. And they had a bell system. I mean, this is a whole lecture in itself of how the blast furnaces work. But you had to be careful because when you charge material in, you did have fumes coming out and escaping. The bells usually kept them contained, but they did have to open up to let the material in. You can see diagonal downcomers for the gas that comes off the furnaces. They use that to feed boilers that made steam to run engines, which pumped air into the furnaces. So these guys were very, very smart. They tried not to let anything go to waste. Now, what really set aside the metal industry from this point on was specialization. We're looking at the 1880s. Once you had Bethlehem Iron Company making iron on a large scale, along with dozens of other producers. The same thing was happening out in Pittsburgh, eventually out in the Midwest around the Great Lakes. So if you were going to survive in the Lehigh Valley, you really had to start doing something special. So when Bethlehem Iron Company was thinking about ways they could survive into the future, they asked the question that a lot of you probably have asked: where do you go for money when the private industry isn't adequately sustaining you? And the answer was government. So their answer came in the form of bidding for an armor plate and gun contract with the Navy. They didn't have a plant sufficient to build it, but they put the bid in anyways. They actually won it. They got a $4.6 million contract, that's in $1887, for guns and armor plate, scrambled over to Europe and purchased the equipment they need, or got the design so they could build it in-house. Because John Fritz, their chief engineer, was a firm believer that you want to be as self-sufficient as possible, build things to last, build at very, very high quality. So some of the things they built in-house were like a 125-ton steam hammer, and that's the dropping weight. This thing was about 90 feet tall, but it shook the foundations of nearby machines to such a degree that they decided to invest in a 14,000-ton forging press only a couple of years later. And that's what you see here, forging a piece of probably armor plate. That press is long gone. It was scrapped during the Korean War, but one of our museum projects coming up this summer is to actually move a similar but slightly smaller 7,000-ton press that's now located in the traffic circle in Bethlehem. That was imported from England as part of that armor plate manufacturing contract in the late 1880s. And this was actually used up through the 1990s, because after they stopped making armor plate at that particular facility, they used it for straightening frames on train cars and a variety of other tasks, like putting the final bends on curved pieces of steel for propane tanks. So they got their money out of it. So it wasn't just Bethlehem Steel that was evolving at this time period. James Henry Carpenter was looking for a place to start a tool steel operation. And when you were looking around the eastern seaboard of the United States at that point in time, some of the cities that would have stood out to you would have been in the Lehigh Valley and also down in Reading. Reading had a large iron industry already, but they had no tool steel producers. So Carpenter was lured there, actually rented part of the old rail mill from the Reading Iron Company, and quickly grew into his own facility. He specialized in making tool steel using crucible furnaces. So you can see a few crucibles on the left. These held maybe 1 to 200 pounds of steel. They actually started with puddling furnaces, making iron. Then you put the iron in there, added some carbon in, and then the carbon would migrate into the iron and melt. And you'd be left with these very small batches of very, very high quality steel. And you can see him pouring one of those batches of steel into, it looks like a ladle, and then it'll probably go into an ingot mold from there. And there you go, seeing some molds being filled with crucible steel. One of their main advancements came a couple of years, actually only 1 year later, when they got a government contract for armor-piercing projectiles. So it's fascinating to me as a historian seeing how Bethlehem was building the armor plate. And then right after they built the plate, they got projectiles from another company, which actually pierced through an 8-inch thick nickel steel face-hardened plate. So it's just a constant battle of advancing technology. So we talked earlier about the zinc company in Bethlehem. You can see today, if you go down there, there's only really a few blocks of land that this thing could have occupied. So if you wanted to grow this onto a truly larger scale, you had to go find a new site. So up in Palmerton, they located a site along one of the anthracite railroads. So they had easy shipment of anthracite coal, easy access to iron ore coming in from New Jersey. Sorry, not iron ore, zinc ore coming in from New Jersey. And they actually built a plant that stretched for miles on the banks of the Lehigh River and then up the tributary in Palmerton. So this is the east plant of the New Jersey Zinc Company. The picture before it shows their laboratories. This is finally in the age when you start getting into finer metallurgical controls, testing. That's something they wish they could have done in the Bessemer era of the 1870s, but the process was so quick and the metallurgical controls so rudimentary that they really didn't have much to speak of in that sense. But by the turn of the century, you started really having this process evolve into a science. And again, I'm sure that's an entire lecture in itself. So as these companies were advancing, you saw existing companies trying to expand and keep up. So you saw the Crane Iron Works installed a new furnace in, I believe 1904 or so. I have to check my notes, but the point is they kept on expanding and expanding and reinvesting. A lot of the other companies died out, especially during the Panic of 1873. The smaller companies just went out of business and never came back. Other companies like smaller businesses like Bride and Horseshoe Company started adding operations like rolling and eventually diversifying their product lines. So you can see as these companies moved throughout time, the improvements paid off in the long run. So what was really interesting to me with doing the research on this project is you see a lot of these advancements, like you go down to Carpenter Steel, you see crucible steel being made in 1899. Then you look at Bethlehem Steel, and you see that they didn't get their crucible steel plant until 1905. That's when Charles Schwab really started hitting hard down in Bethlehem. He had basically, for practical purposes, purchased the company, put a ton of money into it, and started a program of expansion because he knew that as an armaments producer, an armor plate producer, their big contracts would disappear in peacetime. So he wanted to try to find commercial uses for the steel that would support them when the country was not at war or not preparing for war. So in 1905, he added the crucible steel mill. He also added a drop forge. We actually have this display. Part of it is out, but most of it is in storage at our museum here, showing just a wide array of products that they were producing. This is, of course, later than 1905, but same basic process used for mining, pneumatic, aircraft parts. You see all sorts of connecting rods, sprockets, you name it, mortar mounts. And the tool steel division expanded with rolling mills and even its own open hearth plant. But what Bethlehem, really made Bethlehem famous, and I'm sure most of you know this, is that grain mill that made the wide flange beams. This was actually declared an ASM landmark back in the 1990s because it was so significant to the metals industry and really society in general by producing the beams that made skyscrapers possible, longer bridges, and a whole variety of other uses. So the 19-teens, 20s, that's when you really start getting into a period of widespread advancement. And again, it's not just limited to Bethlehem, not just limited to the steel industry. You go back up to Palmerton and you see that this plant is growing like wild. They had started with the West plant in 1898. 1910, they built the East plant. And you can see a whole variety of processes going on. And what made this plant fascinating is that some of these technologies were especially well suited for electric furnace dust. So in the 1980s, this is getting ahead of myself, but it tells the story of why this plant survived. They prohibited the landfilling of electric furnace dust, so they had to look at places that could process it. So Palmerton became one of those places, and they're actually able to use this plant feeding in that electric furnace dust and producing zinc, cadmium, and lead out of it. Now, we talked before about Scranton, how that iron company moved to New York. Well, that's not the end of the story up in Scranton. The land that company was on was sold to the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, and they built a locomotive shop on that site. So by 1913, they were actually building steam locomotives inside that facility. And this facility, after the age of steam ended in the early 1950s, became part of the Scranton Army Ammunition Plant, which is still in service today, making 105 and larger millimeter shell casings for the United States Army. So continuing on through the 19-teens and 20s, you see Bethlehem Steel developing their product line even further. And the same thing is happening really all over the place. You have more independent foundries starting, like in Nazareth. You see heating companies like making. Let's see if I have the slide for it here. steam heaters. This is something that seems like a really simple product. When you start looking at the metals industry, they actually had a small electric arc furnace in the 19 teens. So even these small foundry operations were really state of the art back then. And right near Lehigh Valley in eastern Pennsylvania at Treadwell, they put an electric furnace, Herald furnace, which is what most of these early furnaces were. And they were the only place where you could get castings made from steel made with electric furnaces when they started out right around World War I. 1911, that's when they installed their first electric furnace. 1912, Bethlehem got one. And technology kept on improving from there. These are shots of the furnaces that Carpenter Steel had. They had, I believe, 4 electric furnaces that really transformed their business. That was 1917. And you look at the broader context of what's going on, you have not just World War I happening, which of course made demand go through the roof, but you also had in 1913 over in England, they developed stainless steel, the first commercial successful kind. So you started having American licensees, and that process allowed Carpenter and other firms to really grow and expand and find profitability. That along with tool steels for special purposes. So Carpenter stayed with specialty metals, but Bethlehem Steel was one of the tonnage producers. And if you want to look at tonnage, a good example of this, beyond the wide flange beams everybody knows about, is things like the Lincoln Tunnel tubes. These were actually cast iron rings made at Bethlehem Steel. There are tens of thousands of them. There are several that were bolted together to form one ring, and then layer after layer go all the way across the river. So they built these rings for Lincoln Tunnel, the Path Tunnels, and many other installations. And then there was also another foundry in Catasauqua that was doing the same product line. And we'll try not to spend too much time on Bethlehem because I know you could go on and on and on with this material. But they had massive machine shops that fabricated and machined pieces that were used all over the place. They did castings like for the saddles for the Golden Gate Bridge, maritime castings. You can actually see from this one the scale of how big some of these things were. Like this is for a rudder, and you can see it inside the iron foundry that still exists in Bethlehem today, about a block away from steel sacks. You can see the characteristic stone arches down there on that smallest photograph on the top there. And then just a sense of scale, because some of you might be in smaller foundries, but what blew me away about Bethlehem is normally they put a piece onto a drill press, but in Bethlehem you would put the drill press inside the machine that you're working on. So I believe this is a part for a blast furnace. They actually put the drill press inside it, drilled a ring around the top, and kept on going just through the course of their normal day's work. Now, 1943, the metals industry took a twist that the old timers probably would not have expected. That was when the United States government funded an aluminum plant in Cressona. This plant is still in business today, making aluminum extrusions, and it started making extrusions and tubes. And then you also had additional companies coming in, like Western Electric with their Allentown plant in 1951. That's where the first commercially made transistor radio was produced. We actually have that inside our museum, along with a lot of other samples of like silicon wafers, circuit boards, and really probably a few hundred linear feet of boxes of archival material. Western Electric also expanded into Reading in 1952 when they took an old knitting mill in Laureldale and converted that into a factory for electronic components used for the government. And again, we could go into a whole lecture just on Bethlehem Steel, because all this time period they were adding furnaces, they were adding rolling mills, improving their production. But for some of the highlights, you have 1961 when Homer Research Labs opened. I know at least one of you listening here actually worked there. At one point, they were said to have 1,000 employees. You can see those 3 buildings roughly in the center of the image here. They had pilot plants for a tin mill. rolling mill, vacuum melting, electric furnaces. We actually have the electric arc furnace from their plant and the miniature basic oxygen furnace at our museum. This is sampling of hundreds of slides that we have in our archive showing what they did at the laboratories, testing that they would have done. Images of the vacuum remelting chamber. This is still, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's still a highly respected type of technology that really makes a lot of modern small-scale specialty steelmaking possible. Then their rolling mill, this was actually taken on the second to last day of operation. They consider this a miniature rolling mill, about 1/3 of full size according to what I've been told. But again, there are a lot of commercially operated rolling mills to this day that make this thing look like a giant. But this was 1961 when they opened. In 1967, Carpenter Steel opened their research center that employed about 130 people. And also in that same year, you saw some changes happening with the steel industry. I think I lost my slide for that, unfortunately. But in 1967, the World Trade Center contract was being let out. And Bethlehem Steel assumed that they would get one tower, U.S. Steel would get the other one, but it ended up being let out to smaller subcontractors, and neither of those large steel companies got a large chunk of the business. It ended up going down to their producers, and a lot of foreign steel was used in it. So that was, depending on who you ask, one of the pieces I was writing on the wall for the end of structural steel. But Bethlehem Steel kept on expanding. 1968, they put in a basic oxygen furnace. And you could technically consider that an expansion. Some people would say it's reacting to industry changes that were necessary to survive. But that furnace, those two furnaces survived them until the end of operations in 1995. But what I think you find more interesting is that the year after they installed those furnaces, they actually scrapped a continuous caster at the Bethlehem plant. In 1963, they had an open hearth shop, number 3 open hearth shop that they shut down. They moved production to their Saucon plant, which is where the wide flange beams were produced. They had 2 open hearth shops there. So they took this number 3 open hearth and converted it to research uses. They kept the 2 furnaces going and actually purchased a Western Gear caster. And I'm not sure if this is the caster or not. I didn't have a label, but maybe one of you will recognize it and can tell me which one it is. But the research department got this caster going. It was a commercially sized caster in the Bethlehem plant for research purposes, but they tore it out in 1969, and they started putting, of course, continuous casters in plants that they wanted to keep up to date, like Burns Harbor, Sparrows Point. So the technology was certainly useful to them, but a lot of people in Bethlehem find it very ironic that they had a continuous caster and then got rid of it. So a few more advances before we end up. You have electrostatic remelting furnaces. Those came to Carpenter Steel in 1971, according to the records that I've seen, with 2 25-ton furnaces. And I think my paper froze up on me, but if you guys can still hear me, I'm almost at the end of it. 1974. Added 2 furnaces of their own for electrostatic remelt. Those could handle ingots up to 60 inches in diameter. And those were primarily sold to General Electric after they had gone through the forging process at the heavy forging division. Other advancements that happened in that time period in the local industry, you've had Victaulic opening their Forks Township foundry in 1977. Continuous casting happened at Carpenter Steel for the first time in 1978. 1984, they got their rotary forge. But in 1979, Bethlehem Steel's tool steel division closed down. And then, of course, I think we have memory from ourselves in recent years about the other shutdowns that happened after that. So I wanted to end my presentation on a more positive note. Of course, you have products Bethlehem Steel pioneered at the research labs like Galvalume that can be found all over the place today. This is some of the testing that they did and documented that we have information on at the museum. Changes that, of course, went through. And then the 1985 Atlas was built up at Lehigh. That continues a strong tradition that actually began with the chief engineer of Bethlehem Steel when he donated money for Fritz Research Laboratories. That was John Fritz, of course. He had in his will that he was going to donate the money to Lehigh. But then before he died, he actually wrote we actually changed his will. And he said to Lehigh, I'm not going to give you this money after I die. I'm going to have the fun of spending it with you while I'm still alive. So we actually built and funded a building at Lehigh modeled after number 2 machine shop at Bethlehem Steel for housing the research laboratory. That grew over the years. 1955, they installed the Baldwin Lyman Hamilton testing machine. And then that same tradition, as I'm sure you're all well aware, continued with 1985 with Atlas being developed and still going strong to this very day. So I think this would hopefully give you a rough overview of the metals industry in the area. I could only scratch the surface without going on for hours and hours. But if you have any questions for me, I think this is a good time to take them. And if anybody has other resources that they'd like to let me know about as we do this talk over for public audiences, and think about other things the museum can do to advance our mission of educating the public and inspiring visionaries of tomorrow, we are all ears about that. So back to you.
All right, so this is Chris Marvel speaking now. I just want to say thanks, Mike, for a very nice presentation. So I guess we'll do our best attempt at a round of applause. So I guess if everybody puts up their little clapper hands or something like that. But nonetheless, so it is time for some questions and answers. So what we can try to do is see if anybody has any questions. And what I can try to do is look at the gallery view and see if anybody clicks the reaction that is let's say a thumbs up. So if you do have a question, then give me a thumbs up. All right, Kurt, I see you have a first question.
Oh, I was just giving you a thumbs up in general, but I was surprised at the beginning of the talk when you were discussing bloomeries. At Carpenter Technology, we always thought that those were manufacturers of ladies' underwear.
Say that one more time.
Bloomeries? Weren't bloomeries originally manufacturers of ladies' underwear?
Well, they had a very different connotation back then. And speaking of ladies' underwear, I mean, that's another topic about this I didn't even touch on. But you're not the first steel guy or iron guy who thought about that, because if you look at blast furnace construction in the 1870s, John Fritz was talking about crinoline construction for blast furnaces, which meant that you had hoops going around the furnaces and vertical bars, which resembled the hoop-like structure that was used to support women's skirts in the Victorian era. And then the bustle on the back of their outfits is what they named the pipe that encircles the blast furnace that delivers the hot air. So it's an interesting thought process.
All right, do we have any other questions? Jackson.
This isn't I don't think we really touched on this too much, but I feel like the steel industry as a whole, especially back in the day, kind of had a bad reputation for poor safety standards. I'm sure there is some myth there in addition to some truth, but do you think you could speak a little bit to how accurate that is, how dangerous the industry was back in the day?
Well, by modern standards, it was certainly very dangerous. But if you look at it from the time period, like let's go back to the let's say 1890s, it was, I mean, among heavy industries, it was, I have to look up the exact figures, but I mean, you had plenty of other industries like railroads where you could count your experience by the number of fingers you were missing as a brakeman, or mining. I think the real comparison comes during World War I, when they said there were more people dying along the Monongahela River in the steel mills there than were dying on the fields in France. But by 1913, Bethlehem Steel started instituting a safety program. They had safety meets, competitions, and after that, I mean, the accidents really started making a noticeable decrease. I think between 1906, when records survived from through the 1990s. I think Bethlehem Steel had about 600 fatalities. But those are the ones that we only know about. There were a lot of people who got carbon monoxide poisoning from the furnaces or leaking pipes, went home and died and never got recorded. And same thing like with accidents that happened, they might have been maimed and given a job as sweeping the shop. So it really didn't make the impact that would have made on the ledger books. But the guys working around those workers certainly knew it. What I did find really interesting, though, is a 1929 letter from the blast furnaces that talked about how old the workers were. I just assumed they were young guys that would have been fresh off the boat from Europe, but they said the average age of the workers in the blast furnaces, and one particular department of them was like in the 50s. And sometimes they had workers approaching or over retirement age. So a lot of it probably really depended on where you were working. I know the beam yards were especially dangerous. Other departments, meanwhile, didn't have any recorded deaths in certain years. So it really depended on what your job at the plant was. But yeah, danger was definitely a major concern at the plant. That's why they had their own infirmary. Guys who were there when they were tearing the plant down said they went into the basement and actually found entire cases full of spare arms and legs that they were setting aside for future amputations that never happened.
Thank you for addressing that. Cases of arms and legs are a little disturbing to think about, but I'm glad they were not needed, I suppose.
This is part of our history.
All right, Kurt, did I see that you have another question?
Yeah, I do have a real question. How long did it take for you to collect all of these materials? Showing all these different plants in eastern Pennsylvania. It's pretty amazing. Is what you've drawn together.
Some of them I've like over the years at the museum, I've just kept a mental note of like where I've seen pictures at, and try to just remember where I could go back and find them. Other ones I literally just Google, but just figuring out the name of what to search for can be take some time to figure out. And then of course some of them are my own photographs, like the ones I took at Homer Labs in 2005. It was one of those occasions when I got a tour there, I knew I ought to take a picture because I'd want to use it someday. So I just keep on stashing these things around, and as I get a tour of plants and visit places or look in history books, I try to make mental notes or start saving files so I can go back to them and start piecing this history together. Because in the research for this talk, I probably only told you about a third or so of what I actually uncovered, because there's really just so much information out there. It's really mind-boggling. But I've gotten in the habit of making notes now and making timelines and trying to figure out where I found this stuff at. Because once you find it, it might take 10 years, 20 years before you come across it again, just accidentally, even at a museum.
All right, do we have any other questions? I guess I have one question that's not as scientific, and maybe this will be the last question unless anybody else has a really pressing one, since we are getting pretty close to 7:30. So I'm interested in the museum that you have, mostly because I know the steel stacks have really been built up recently. It's actually really nice now compared to what it was before. So I'm wondering if you have any new exhibits that are going to be opening soon, or what do you think at the moment is probably the most exciting piece that you have to share with everybody if they were to visit?
So if you visit the museum today, I'd say the most exciting piece is probably our coreless steam engine, simply because of the fact that it runs. It has a 14-foot diameter flywheel. And even though it's not a steel industry piece, I think the steel industry guys will appreciate just the massive castings in it. I think one piece alone weighs 30,000 pounds. So when the steel workers look at this, they're like, wow, this thing had to be having cast upside down so the impurities flow to the top. Then they would have planed it off, flipped it over, and use that as the basis to build the engine from. And also that machine is almost a twin to like 4 engines Bethlehem Steel used for pumping water. And pretty much every industrialized city that had not a non-gravity fed system that required pumping would have had giant engines like that. So that's like the most exciting piece. We also have on loan from the Smithsonian, the first steam-powered hammer in America. It's 19 feet tall. It really gives you a sense of how that technology developed over time and just the sheer size of it. And then I think coming up this summer when we move that 300-ton bending press that has the capacity of 7,000 tons, I think that's going to be just mind-boggling. It's only going to move 3,000 feet, but just when you're dealing with something that's like 20 feet tall, moving it down the road, it's going to be quite a project.
Yeah.
So I think we have a lot to look forward to. And coming up, we want to do some more interesting things. Like we have a small cupolet furnace. We want to do iron casting. We have an induction furnace squirreled away. I'd love to get that thing running someday. So I think we really have a lot of potential in the museum. And once we solve some storage issues, who knows what's going to float in here, because I'd love to see some more modern pieces come in, because it's the more modern stuff that really gets scrapped out before people have the chance to think about how historic it is. So we want to keep on making the place relevant, make it exciting, make it someplace that you want to take your family and have your kids come and say, wow, that thing runs, or wow, you can actually make something with this, and maybe inspire them to have a career in the field.
Yeah, that's very nice. All right, well, so I guess I'll give an opportunity for one last quick question, but I don't see anybody's hand raised. So what I would like to do is thank you, Mike, one more time for a very nice talk. And
it's so brief. I think that's good for you guys, but again, we only scratched the surface with what we could talk about, but it sounds like some of you learned some new things, so I'm glad we were able to do it.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right.
Thanks again, Mike.
Yep. So thank you again, Mike. So I think that'll conclude our meeting for this evening. So everybody stay safe and hang in there, and I'm sure we'll see each other soon.
Very good. Thank you. Nice program.
Good night, all.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Good night.